Hey friends out there in YouTube land, today we're talking about gear I use at weddings. This is just some of my Sony gear that I use. I've got a big shoot coming up and I wanted to share with you how some of that's going to go down. So if you're interested in that kind of nerdy stuff, this is the video for you. Let's take it away. Friends, I'm Rob with Robert Hand Photography. Today I'm going to be talking to you about the gear I use at some of my weddings. This is Sony gear that I use, or at least Sony cameras. It doesn't really matter. I've got different kits that I might use depending on the situation. But the biggest thing is I just kind of wanted to share with you what's in my bag, so to speak. But I really don't want it to be what's in my bag. I've got years of experience using this gear specifically, and I'll share with you what I like and don't like about it. And I'll share with you kind of like how I came across some of the gear that I am currently using. Yeah, so let's take it away. I want to talk about the cameras, but I'm going to put those in the back, the latter half. I want to first talk about the flash system that I use. And I switched over to Godox flash, or Strobes, also known as Flashpoint. They're rebranded in the USA. If you want to pay more for the same flash, buy the Flashpoint. It's that simple. If you want to pay less for the same flash, buy Godox. It's that simple. Godox has some strange things that they do with Sony specifically. They don't use metal, or didn't use metal hot shoes for the longest time. The newer versions may have hot shoes on their V1 series strobes. I like these because they're round heads and have cool attachments like this dome. Makes it easy, doesn't fall off, minimalistic stuff like that. But this means that over time, not only can this snap, which I've had happen to me multiple times, but also even if it doesn't snap, the hot shoe itself can become worn down because it's plastic. Now, from what I understand, Sony may be making, or Godox may be making these with the metal style, which I'll show you right here. On this Panasonic strobe, this means that it has a much more solid connection because the base plate is thicker. This is a thing, I'll talk about that a little bit more, but I'm putting this up front in the video because sometimes these 15-minute videos, people don't watch all the way to the end, so they may miss the real important information they need, because where did everybody's attention span go? Like, we're going to talk about camera flash and strobes and stuff like that. It's not a 3-second conversation, at least not to me. There's no way it could be. If you know anything about it more than makes bright light, right, then you know there's more to talk about than 3 minutes. But that's a conversation for another YouTube analytics. The point that I'm making is Sony's hot shoe, that micro interface hot shoe, the MI hot shoe, has a lot of special connectors on it. It's very important for those connectors to stay properly seated and without being bent. So having a plastic hot shoe can screw that up royally, because the base plate that the connectors use to reinforce where they ride on isn't really strong. And over time, just by putting it in and out of the hot shoe, you can wear down the plastic. The next thing is, this design sucks. I've talked about it in another video. A couple years ago, I made a video of how to replace the V1 and V60 and V62 and 3 hot shoes. And you could replace them pretty much with any kind of amount that you wanted. These are attachment pieces that are made to be replaced. They did that because I believe they know it's a bad design. This rotating ring right here does not really keep a lot of pressure. It allows for quick on and off. It's like a quick release, but it doesn't allow for a lot of pressure like a screw down knob. So it means that the flash can kind of wobble around. A screw down knob can actually be screwed on so tight sometimes that I've had to use pliers to get it off and stuff like that from my other ones. That one right there. Doesn't matter. In any event, the next part is that this is a floating design, so this attachment is actually connected through this housing on springs, 2 springs. They're relatively tight springs, but that gives the flash a little bit of wobble. Now, why in the world would they create flash with wobble at the connection point to the camera? The answer is simple. Because the flash is extremely heavy, and they know that this is going to be the largest failure point and it's likely to break, so they basically made a crumple zone on it. I have broken countless number of these strobe shoes over the years and replaced them. It's a $19 or $20 replacement. You can get the stuff from B&H. B&H or Adorama, but I believe it's B&H. It might be Adorama, actually, is a service center for Godox USA, which means you can send your stuff there and have it fixed. I think it's Adorama. However, you can get the replacement parts at B&H or Adorama. And if I remember, I'll put a link down below. Okay, I spent a lot of time talking to you about the Godox V1 series and V60, 860 Mark II and 3, because these are the on-camera hot shoe strobes that I've got experience with, and I've got a lot of good things to say about them. So I want you to hear the bad stuff, the terrible stuff up front. I use these strobes because I had been using Yongyo YN560 Series 4s or 3s for the longest time, and they were great. I've got manual flash down like a fine science. It's no problem. Multicam triggers, whatever, doesn't matter. But getting to have high-speed sync was something I really wanted, and Godox was able to offer that in a package that was sleek, works well, with a lot of functionality and wireless capability built in. Then once I got started using TTL flash with multiple strobes that synced up, all these strobes right here will sync with one another, I realized just how powerful that can be, because they're smarter than just a particular strobe. They will all link up with one another. You can, of course, control the groups, but they will also do pre-flashes if you wish them to, even groups that are off camera, so that if you have a multi-camera or multi-flash, multi-strobe setup, each one will get a different meter reading to its subject, whatever that be, that you can set. And in TTL, you can adjust them as groups, plus or minus one, so they each have their own exposure readings based off of your camera from wherever you are to wherever they are, and then they sync, or you can adjust them manually individually. So you could imagine that over time of using a lot of manual photography, manual stroboscopic photography, coming to something like this was a big upgrade. Now you're going to say to me, Rob, of course, they've had this out for a long time. Yes, and I wasn't willing to pay for it in Sony, Canon, or Nikon. I just wasn't going to pay $600, $700 for a strobe. It's not happening. It will not. I can't say that it will not ever happen, but it's ridiculous to pay that much money for a flash. If you agree, leave a like down below. Enter the enter the V1 series by Godox. Around, I think, $250 you can get them for, something like that. So for the price of one 650 ERT or whatever, the big Canon one, you can, with the magic lantern, all this stuff built in, yeah, you can get 2 or 3 of these. That was always my argument. I'm always looking for a value proposition in photography. So let's talk about how that works. Before I bring this down, I want you to notice the cameras that are up here, specifically the lens selection that I've got for you. This is a Sony a7 III paired with the Sigma 24-70 f2.8. It's a lens that I enjoy using but regret buying. I preferred the Sony 24-120. I believe it was the 24-120 f4, and that macro. You guys know I prefer 24-105 or 24-120 lens anytime. So Nikon, for their full frame, made a beautiful 24-120 f4 lens I liked quite a bit. Anyway, the thing I don't like about the Sigma lens, on the wide angles at 24 millimeters, there's so much distortion and stuff like that. And I use that a lot. Otherwise, it's a fine lens. It's got great optics and stuff. I don't worry about the price. It's just, I'd take the, you know how I feel. I'd take a 105 f4 any day. 105 f4s usually also have macro, and I do a lot of macro, and so this has a 50% macro, but my Panasonic 24-105 has a 3 times macro. So instead of a 2-time macro, it's got a 3 times macro. Obviously, that gets me more interesting shots for my ring shots without having to change my lens. And the f4, I know we were talking about flash. I guess we're just going to kind of jump into this lens part for a second. The f4, people are so worried about that 2.8 to f4 difference. That stop or so of light, man, if that's going to kill you in your reception photography, then just buy another lens, right? It doesn't even have to be expensive. You get so much more in the additional reach and compression in the background for portraiture that you would with just the 24-70 variant f2.8. It's a huge deal. And yes, the f2.8's great. You do notice the additional stop of light, specifically in dark situations. My statement here, what I'm saying is I believe that the extra reach that you get completely overblows the extra stop of light or so that you get, especially with cameras and their brand new ISOs, these new generation of ISOs. It's even like the stop of light's not that important. And if you're arguing that 2.8 will give you more bokeh than f4, yeah, but it won't be anything like the difference between f1.8 and f4. So if you really want a bokeh, jump up with an f1.8. But if you're doing group portraiture, are you really shooting groups at f1.8 or 2.8? If you answer yes to that question, leave a comment down below on how you do it and some link to your work. I'd love to know that technique, because I don't shoot groups. I don't shoot groups at f1.8 or f4. I might shoot groups at f4 actually. I usually will choose f5, 6, f7, especially if I've got I'm on a beach usually, so I've got a long distance in the background, so I can get everyone in a group of 20, 30 people in focus and put them far enough away from the horizon line that it blurs out, even at something like f8 if I wanted to use that. So that's my point that I'm talking about here. We're going to jump back into the flash. I hope you enjoyed that quick tangent. So why do I use these strobes? Well, it's mainly because I can sync them all with this special, command module right here. Any one of these, except the 8200 Pro right there, will also add that function, except I can command them from the strobe themselves. Here, I can do it on camera with this flash, or I can use an off-camera unit. The nice part about the off-camera unit is it just gives me the ability to move around a little bit more without impacting the light scene as I've set up. Obviously, if there's a strobe on the camera and I'm moving around for portrait, three-point light source portraiture or something like that, then I'm affecting how my light is hitting the subject if I choose to change or move my spot. And if you've ever done formal portraits of a group of people indoors, outdoors, on the beach, in the mountains, wherever you go, you'll know that sometimes you don't want to change between your group settings and your individual settings, the lighting setup, too much. You might have found a perfect placement for your lights in that particular environment, and you want to shoot groups as well as couples and individuals, and you want to do it quickly. Well, having a flash on top of your camera can interrupt that because it means you'll have to constantly be resetting it. If you're simply setting up your strobes and your lights are properly there, then you can move in and out as you would get closer for a group or a small group or a couple or an individual, and you would step further away, but your light will still impact the scene in the same way. So that's one of the reasons that we'll use one of these strobe or strobe commanders rather than just using the strobe on top of the camera. Of course, you can do that and turn the light off so that it doesn't strobe, but then you lose light. Okay, now that we've got that talked about, and there's lots of different groups that you can use with any of these. This will do like any of these strobes by themselves will command up to 3 groups plus the manual group for itself. They might even do 6. I know that that one will do at least 6, and however many strobes are on the circuit. But the 8200 Pro here is really the big winner, right? This guy right here is really the 200 watt second, I believe it is, sun gun that works for great group settings. This weekend I'm going to a big wedding up in the mountains of Virginia. There's going to be a mansion that we're going to, 17 rooms, bedrooms, huge, halfway up the mountain on an overlook is where the wedding's going. It's a quarter mile away from the mountain, coming back down. It's a huge reception area with parquet dance floors outside in the twilight with the honeycomb and the fairy lights and everything else. It's going to be beautiful. That mountain scene overlooking the valley is going to be great right around sunset. You could just imagine, right? But what happens after the sun goes down and they're outside? If you're photographing outdoors in ambient light, so many people shy away from strobes. They're ambient light photographers. And that's great. But if you're photographing a wedding, you're going to need some light. And the problem with light is how do you get it and how bright is it and how much do you need? Well, this right here really does a great job lighting up situations exactly like that. I will very easily put this on a 10-foot or 12-foot light stand, anchor it to the ground somewhere else, and I'll angle it to the dance floor somewhere far away, right? And I will quite likely also put a strobe bowl on here to focus it forwards. That way, this light source can be further away and on a really high setting, which will allow there to be a nice soft ambient light as it disperses and diffuses a little bit the further away you get. We're not talking science or any physics right here, but the inverse square law helps a lot in using this very small, very bright source to make it more diffuse over distance. It does lose power, which is why you'll need some additional lights. In this instance, I might use this light to be my main key light for that setting as the sun's going down and getting some of that additional fill light for the room, and or even rim light depending on how I want to use it. Sometimes it's fun to shoot into a strobe just to get that bright light. But in any event, I'll put it somewhere to use in that situation. And then these might actually go on camera. And when they're on camera by themselves, they could very simply be adding that additional light that we want to give some fill. In that case, I'd be using the 8200 Pro as the rim light. I know I'm putting all this stuff together, but isn't it fun to see these things as they're happening? So once we get this strobe on the camera, in this instance, I can now control the 8200 Pro from here on the camera and the camera light itself. of course, in this instance, I will be focusing my light straight forwards. People are going to say, they say all the time, you can't do that. How many weddings have you shot where you don't, where you're outside, you can't bounce, and you're not going to focus it straight forwards? Yeah, but it becomes too harsh. Does it? Does it really? How strong do you have your strobe? Like, how high up do you have it? I do it all the time. And I'll usually set my power on my flash that's on camera in this direction when I'm close to people at something very low, depending on the situation, 2 or 3 orders of magnitude, 2 or 3 complete stops lower than what else is out there. And then I've got something that really can work some wonders. Now, there's another way that I like to photograph, and that's actually using this camera right here. This is the A7R2. Where's my 28f2? The Sony 28f2 is a really cool lens, and I think it pairs perfectly with this camera. Okay, and I think it pairs great with the camera because there's just something about the 42 megapixel sensor here. There's the right amount of sensor and the right amount of megapixels that allows it to just have a bit of a character to it. It's not so, it reminds me so much more of, it's just a generation older sensor than the current gen, and if you're used to everything in the current gen, then it's just so sterile. I think there's a lot of character in this, and I like the 28 millimeter focal length quite a bit. But this also gives me something else that I can do, which is a lot of fun. When I shoot the reception, I really like getting into the action with people when they're dancing. The 28 can get me there nice and close. The 28 allows people's arms to be really exaggerated. Look how long my arm looks right here. Do you see that? My arm's not really that long. You know that, right? Okay. But when you're dancing and you've got a lens like this, you can get really close, turn the camera kind of sideways to them, and as they're dancing and all that stuff, you can really get some exaggerated looks. So many people say far away, and they'll use their 85 or their 50 to get away from the action, or their telephoto to get away from the action. But the reality is, you're missing all of the immersive shots. And when you're dancing with the bride and groom, they never see you. So by the time they get their shots later, and you've gone ahead and shown them something amazing when they were dancing with those really exaggerated looks like we talked about, and it doesn't have to be as exaggerated as this. You can choose to compose differently. They love them. They absolutely love them. But there's something else that it'll do. You can add the 21 millimeter conversion lens to it, or even the fisheye conversion lens, and you've got a really awesome f2.8 lens setup right now at 21 millimeters that is very compact and versatile. That doesn't take a lot to switch out. It's very simple. So in that instance, I enjoy using the camera that way for that reason quite specifically. How about that? Let's talk a little bit more about how I use the strobe in that situation. I will still point it forward, but I will turn it down quite a bit, and I'll usually put it on manual at this point. This is the V862 Sony, the 2 or the 3. It doesn't matter which one you have. Turn it down to 1/256 power. This is going to give you the ability to put down your little diffusion shield right here and shoot straight and not have too much light to burn out whites or blow out your highlights and things like that. It allows you to get nice and close. Now, remember, we're talking about in an environment that you don't have a ceiling to bounce something off of. If you've got a ceiling, always use bounce. If you don't, then you can do this, but just turn the power down quite a bit. Some people might say, oh, we're going to get a diffuser or a modifier. See, that's why I like Godox, right? The diffuser is very small. They attach with the MagMod style system. They just magnetize on, and you can use that pretty easily. I would never put a big diffuser box on here. I did for a long time use the Gary Fong Light Sphere. I thought that worked well, but when I switched from using the Yongyo YN560s to the Godox V1s, I switched completely, and I enjoy it. Now, I've got several of these strobes, like I said, specific to Sony, and they have, all of my Sony ones had that broken hot shoe problem. I have not had that on my Panasonic ones, and I think that's because of the metal hot shoe. Let's talk about something else here, too. You saw me earlier using the, where'd it go? You saw me earlier using the 70 to 200 on this camera right here. This is the Sony A7R2. Now, the 70 to 200, this is the f4 variant. Good lens. I like it quite a bit. Again, I don't mind that it's f4. You could pay the extra money and get the f2.8. Definitely will be helpful. You're going to have something that's almost twice as big and quite a lot heavier. The expense in that instance isn't really the important part. But what I will tell you is that this lens, in my opinion, does not resolve well on this sensor. It's 42 megapixels with the G glass. It may for you, it may just be this body sensor setup, but I feel like when I'm using this, I don't get the kind of sharpening that I want on this high resolution sensor. So what do I do? Well, if you said switch it out with the A7 III, you're exactly right. And sometimes people say things like, why would you do that? Because if you switch it out, then you're losing all of the upgraded autofocus and such that you get from the A7 III to put it over here on the A7 to switch the two lenses out, to put the A7 III and use the 70 to 200, and then you don't get the extra length that you would get from your telephoto and all this stuff. To that I say, nah. If you're shooting, let's talk about this a little bit differently. First of all, I don't have a problem between the autofocus systems here. It's not that big of a deal in any way. The A7 III does have a better autofocus system than the A7R II. But if you're shooting, where do you think you would need the most cropping ability for post-production? In your general purpose lens or in your specialty lens? Like if I'm shooting here, where am I going to do the cropping? Well, cropping usually is to get you closer, to kind of zoom in. Yeah, I'm not going to crop as much. I'm not doing wildlife either. So I'm doing portraits. So I'm likely not to crop as much on the A7 III with the 70 to 200, right? Because I'm going to zoom in to get my portrait shots or whatever. But let's say I was doing shots of my more general photography, everything from macro shots to detail shots of the ring to my general purpose, my wide, some portraiture and stuff like that, anything throughout the entire day. Well, that's where I would want to have more ability to crop, because this is going to be a more general tool. And if I was going to do post-production cropping, I might want to have the additional resolution to do so. So in this case, I actually switched the strobes as well. This zoom lens and this strobe work well together. So that's one of the reasons I always put the 860 Mark II on this lens, because it zooms so nicely. 70 all the way out to 200. I love it. It's perfect. So I've got everything that I need right there. And then, of course, if I'm zoomed into 200, I don't worry as much about just the different flash pattern right here. And I don't worry about its intensity because I'm further away. Unless I am doing portraiture, in which case I might do something with the strobe in order to diffuse it a little bit. And in those instances, I will usually turn the power down to help diffuse it before I add a modifier. If I'm adding a modifier, it's because I want quite a bit of diffusion. And if I'm going to shoot portraiture like that, I'd rather just use an off-camera strobe like the 8200. I'll put it in a softbox or a beauty dish or something like that and command it wirelessly. The only thing we haven't really talked about is these smaller lenses over here, the 85 and the 50. Put the 50 down, something like. When would I use these? I think I would use these mostly, especially because what we've talked about so far is what I use mainly. When I first got started, the 50 was kind of like the lens that I got and continued. So this is the lens I've had the longest out of all of these. The 85 was more specialty, but I used the 85 for quite a bit of photography before I got the 70 to 200 that we just talked about. Once I picked up to the 70 to 200, even at f4, remember portraiture, distance, and compression, this didn't get used as much. But I will use this for special times on the dance floor during the reception. I will take the 85 specifically, turn this into a light source, a point light source like DJ lights or something, and just stay on the bride and groom until I get a cool shot of the lights going off, the lasers going off, and a backlit subject. It's usually pretty neat. Using the strobe, like we talked about, the 8200, as the sun gun for the room or the venue, then allows me to give just enough front light or rim light to get that background coolness and whatever happening out there. I'll do the same thing with the 50, but it doesn't seem to work as well as the 85 for me, for that specific purpose. For general photography, if you had to get one first lens that could do it all, I would say your 50 and your 28 would probably be your two wide aperture lenses that you could jump with and get whatever you needed, portraiture to wide angle stuff. Yeah, there we go. That's my conversation for today. Guys, I hope that you have enjoyed this look at some of the gear that I use and why I use it. I recognize that maybe it was a little rambly. Up to you. Tell me what you think down in the comments below. But these are my thoughts on the gear, and I guess it kind of took everything down. So there we go. I want to thank you for watching and remind you I'll catch you on the flip side. Bye for now.